This year is the 105th anniversary of the 1916 enlistment of Japanese Canadian soldiers in Alberta during the First World War. The 80th anniversary of the start of the war in the Pacific during the Second World War. The 90th anniversary of the Japanese Canadian First World War veterans receiving the right to vote in British Columbia. The 68th anniversary of the Korean Armistice, and the 10th anniversary of the end of Canada's combat mission in Afghanistan. Canadians of Japanese ancestry have served honorably and with distinction in all of these conflicts. Today, we honor all those who have served. Most of us are very much aware of the personal trauma and sacrifice experienced by members of the Japanese Canadian community during the Second World War as a result of the forced removal from the West Coast and the internment of some 21,000 members of the community in 1942. However, not many are aware of the service of Japanese Canadians in the Canadian Armed Forces during World War II. I know that all of you have a personal link in some way to those who have served, whether as members of the Japanese Canadian community or in other communities. And while there were many challenges and injustices that existed at that time, I know that our other Asian communities, such as the Chinese Canadian community and the Indigenous community, suffered many things as well, but nonetheless served with distinction on behalf of Canada.
Let our thoughts and focus remember all the names on the plaques that surround the cenotaph and the conflict on the petals, and all Canadian veterans on this day to honor that we shall never forget. Teaching those who practice faith don't just worship the divine parent, they also sincerely help people in energy.
In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep till poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
The act of remembrance. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not worry them, nor the years condemn them. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. We stand beneath the majesty of the Japanese Canadian War Memorial on this 90th anniversary of the Japanese Canadian veterans of World War I gaining the right to vote in 1931. In 2011, this event was recognized by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada as an event of national historic significance because it was the first time that persons of Asian ancestry were given the right to vote in British Columbia. While Canada was permitting limited numbers of Asians to immigrate in the late 1800s, there was growing resentment against all Asians in British Columbia. This resulted in the BC government passing laws forbidding persons of Asian ancestry having the right to vote. In order to prove their allegiance to Canada during World War I, former members of the disbanded Japanese Canadian Corps learned that the Calgary Highlanders in Alberta were recruiting and accepting Japanese Canadians to volunteer as long as they enlisted as individuals. In 1916, 227 determined Japanese Canadians traveled to Alberta to enlist. They fought in all the major wars, including Vimy Ridge and Hill 70. At the end of World War I, the Japanese Canadian soldiers returned to Vancouver and commenced a concerted effort to fight for the right to vote. In 1931, my grandfather, Sergeant Masumi Mitsui, as president of the newly formed Canadian Legion Local Branch No. 9, led the contingent to Victoria to lobby the British Columbia legislators in an effort for all persons of Asian ancestry, of Japanese ancestry, to gain the right to vote. The group included Corporal Sanosuke Kubota, businessman Saburo Shinobi, Naburo Murakami, Rizuko Hoita, Nobue Watanabe, and Legion Provincial Secretary Robert McNichol. On the second reading and by a single vote, their efforts were partially successful, as only the Japanese Canadian veterans of World War I were given the right to vote in BC, while the rest of the Japanese Canadians had to wait until 1949 for the franchise. The contingent returned to Vancouver to celebrate their partial victory and insisted that they first proceed to the Japanese Canadian War Memorial to honor their fallen comrades, for it was they who had made the ultimate sacrifice in their quest for the franchise. Today we recognize the 90th anniversary of the First World War Japanese Canadian veterans' relentless fight for the right to vote, and also the 100th anniversary of the Poppy. This 102nd Day of Remembrance, we remember and honor our courageous Japanese Canadian War veterans of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the war in Afghanistan. In the immortal words of my grandfather, they are not forgotten, lest we forget.
Good morning, everyone. When I come to this particular ceremony, I find that I'm always choked up. And so please forgive me. When you think of the fact that the Japanese Canadians who came here in 1887 first were not allowed to vote, were not treated equally, and yet they stepped up. In World War I, World War II, you voted. And they were never even given the right to vote in British Columbia, and only the veterans were given that right, as you just heard, in 1931. It was only in 1949 that the federal government allowed the franchise for the Japanese to vote. And yet, they persisted. And at a time of crisis, I think even now we need to look back at that self-sacrifice that said duty called, duty to others, duty and responsibility to the greater good, made Japanese Canadians go forward when they were not called. They volunteered to go forward and give that ultimate sacrifice, that self-sacrifice that all of us need to remember. So, lest we forget, this is part of our Canadian history.
Thank you. I feel humbled to be here because indeed the examples we've heard, it's hard to believe. The sacrifice, the challenge, the hatred, the discrimination, the beauty, the love, the joy that these veterans, their families, have given for all of us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to everyone in service, to our veterans, and to those still serving today. The difference that you've made, and the difference that you make will be with us forever. Thank you.
I am honored and humbled to be part of this Remembrance Day ceremony honoring the bravery of Japanese Canadian soldiers. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people who have stewarded this land, air, and waters since time immemorial. We're here today to remember and pay our respects to those who have served to protect us all. It's a reminder of the contributions that Japanese Canadians have made to this country. I remember my grandfather, a fisherman working out of Steveston, telling me about his friends who were forcibly moved to the interior, whose fishing boats were confiscated and sold. They were good people, he said, because they were good fishermen, and every day reminds us of all Canadian military veterans of Japanese ancestry who gave the ultimate sacrifice. We must learn, be grateful, and remember.
Okay, my grandfather immigrated to Canada in 1908, and at the time he had been rejected by the Japanese military, and his father was an officer in the Japanese Navy, and he felt very badly about being rejected, so he needed to leave Japan, he felt, and came to Canada. So he started the Mitsui family in Victoria. He started off as a dishwasher and a chauffeur at the Empress Hotel. And soon after that, he started farming. But he realized that, as did most of the Issei, they realized that they needed to have citizenship so that they could influence policy and laws and have a say in how they are governed. So they started to, back then they started to talk about getting the franchise. But then World War I came, and he and the rest of his Issei felt that if they had volunteered, if they could volunteer for the military, Canadian military, it would demonstrate their allegiance to Canada and that they were committed to being Canadian and wanted to support Canada during the war. So they created the Japanese Corps and in Vancouver and trained on their own, and they decided that they needed to be organized to present themselves to the government of Canada in order to show that they were serious about their commitment to being Canadian. But because of the racism and discrimination, and the Federal Minister of Defense rejected them outright, and the next day they were disbanded. But soon after, they found out that they could enlist in Alberta as individual if they traveled themselves to Calgary, and 227 eventually did travel to Calgary and volunteered. So his aim all along, as with the rest of the Issei, was to become fully fledged Canadian citizens. And I totally respect their decision to fight for Canada, because they wanted Canadian citizenship. They wanted to be Canadian. And in spite of all the racism and in spite of all of the discrimination and the laws that the British Columbia government passed preventing them from doing it, they demonstrated that they were very courageous and they were very determined soldiers, and when they fought for the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. So my grandfather, and I knew him as a young child, up until my teenage years, was a very determined man, and he was very committed to the military. But after World War II and being interned, he had total disrespect for the government because of they took away his property and his farm, and they put him in the internment camps, and then they were shipped east, and eventually ended up in Hamilton. So the memories that I have of my grandfather is somebody who's very stalwart. He was very rigid, I think because of his military upbringing, but he was very quiet. He never talked about the war at all. The only time that I knew that he was a soldier was on Remembrance Day, because on Remembrance Day, after World War II rather, he honored his fallen comrades in the privacy of his own home. He would put on his beret, he would put on his uniform, and he would shine his medals, and he would have a silent, solitary remembrance of his fallen comrades at home. And on one of the occasions when we were visiting him on Remembrance Day, and my dad tells me I was about 5 or 6 years old, I crawled up on his lap, because that was one of my favorite spots when we were visiting him, and I was playing with his medals, and they were on his chest. And I said, "Oh, Grandpa, could I have those medals?" And my grandfather told me that those are Grandpa's right now, but someday you'll get them. And after he passed away in 1987, they were bequeathed to me. So I have his World War I medals. So that's one of my, I guess, hugest memories of my grandfather, on Remembrance Day, and that was as a young child. Yeah. This is the 90th anniversary of the Japanese Canadian veterans getting the right to vote in British Columbia, and every Remembrance Day is significant because we remember all of the Japanese Canadian veterans and soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice and put their life on the line and made the commitment to fight for Canada. So to me, it's a day to honor their memory. And I remember, fondly my grandfather, and I'm sure, all the other families remember their ancestors as well. But it's a day to show respect and to remember what they accomplished. And one of their main reasons for volunteering for World War I was to get the right to vote. And they had to fight or they had to battle the racist politics in British Columbia. They had to battle the very determined enemy over in Europe, and they had to battle racism amongst their fellow soldiers and officers that didn't want them there at all. So it was it's a very significant, I think, moment for them to be able to put their life on the line and show that much commitment to show they're true patriots of Canada.
I served in the military for the Canadian Armed Forces for 12 years. And then now I'm part of the primary reserve list. I'm a retired major in the military, and I served in Afghanistan for 2 tours. And when I come to ceremony for Remembrance Day, it makes me definitely remember some of the really great memories I had with the military, because we did make sacrifices, and I think it helps us to remember the good things that they stood for, and that reason why we joined the military to begin with. He'd like to talk about some of the things that he saw and did when he was in the war, um, World War II, he drove a truck onto the beaches of Normandy. And I really liked listening to the stories he told me. When he went to the beach, there was still gunfire and lots of vehicles. He drove a truck. He remembered the people that he met when he went through the villages in France and Belgium and Netherlands, and how happy they were. And so all the memories that he told me were very happy ones, and it definitely is a great example to me. I definitely felt that sense of being part of something that's bigger than our own lives, and I really like being able to feel that type of rewarding feeling that you're really making a difference.
It's actually my great-grandfather, Hiyojitsan. He came to Canada around 1910, and maybe a bit earlier, but about 1910, from Hiroshima. Yeah, like everyone, well, not everyone knows, but many people know, he and many other Japanese Canadian or new immigrants felt that to be part of Canadian society and to contribute to their new country, they volunteered to fight for Canada in World War I. Unfortunately, he passed away long before I'd never had an opportunity to meet him, but coming here today, every year for this ceremony, and in particular, it feels important to be here. He was, from what I heard from my mother, he was just a very quiet guy, very typical Japanese man, very stoic, very majime, and yeah, I mean, his name was Masajiro Shishido. His name's on the plaque over there, but yeah, but nothing too exciting, to be honest. He was just a typical guy trying to make his life in a new country and look after his family, but serving his country, his new country, in the war, I think maybe made the connection to Canada even more.
Okay, I mentioned my great uncle's name. He is the brother of my grandfather on my mother's side, and he was in Vancouver. He came about 1910. He joined the Nihonjinkai, the group that trained to go to war in the First World War. But then when they were not able to join in British Columbia, he was very disappointed. But he learned almost as soon as they were told that officially that they would not be able to join in British Columbia, he heard that they could join in Alberta. So he and 13 others, well, he was one of 13 who went to Calgary by train in 1916 and enlisted in what was then called the Canadian Mounted Rifles. So he was one of the very, very early, very first ones to join. He went to England to train in 1916, went to war in France in the late fall, just before the winter of 1916. And so he was also there in 1917 when they had the Battle of Vimy Ridge and all of those battles. He was in Passchendaele. He was in the Somme. He was wounded 3 times, suffered from a gas attack. So he was a very determined individual. He was, if you see his pictures, he wasn't a very big. He was very short. He was one of the shorter ones in the picture, and but he was very determined. And I remember, but I only remember him when he was old already, and he was always very ill, sick, and part of that was because of his injuries during the war and because of the gas that had ruined his lungs. After the war in 1919, he came back from the war, and he got money from a loan from the Veterans Land Act. So that was for the veterans of the First World War, and he bought a farm in Langley. And he worked very hard because it was a farm, but it was really just land with trees. And so he had to remove the trees. That was very hard work. But he was able to clear some land, and he was able to get married. And they had, trying to think of total how many children, at least 6 or 7, if I remember correctly. After all of the pain and suffering, they were starting to do better on the farm, and then in 1942, it was all taken away. And he was very, very angry about that, because when they came to have him move, he said, "This is not right. I'm a veteran. I served in the First World War." He showed him his medals. He says, "You can't do this." But they did it anyways. For a little while, he served as a security guard at Hastings Park at that time, and he thought that he would be doing some service for the country at that time. But even after that, they still forced him to move, and he was moved to Tashme. He was very, very bitter. But it was very interesting. I did some research under the Landscapes for Injustice that was done through the University of Victoria, and did a very, very fine job, and all the records are there. And I found in those records for my great uncle, Kinoshita Seiichi-san, I found a newspaper article from the Vancouver province. And in 1945, there was a national election, a federal election. And Seiichi-san and one other, Sato-san, got a ride from Tashme and came to Hope and voted. He was very, very determined. The war with Germany had ended in May of 1945, but the war with Japan was still did not end until September of 45, and so this was, I think, in July that he came, and so he was determined to exercise his vote that he won in 1931 as a result of his service in the First World War. So it was interesting. I said, this is an interesting man. He was a very, very clear about his rights and his determination to vote and to be recognized as a Canadian. So that was something that I learned that was very interesting. I learned also a lot of things about his service during the First World War. It was a terrible war, and he was wounded 3 times, but he went back each time. He didn't need to, he could have gone home, but he went back to serve. So I owe a great deal to him, and I didn't know this about him very much, and it's only in recent years that I've found out more about his service and what he did. I did learn a bit more about my own father, lwaasa Toru. He served in the Second World War. He was born and grew up in Raymond, Alberta. So he was not prevented from joining the Canadian Army in the Second World War. Those in British Columbia could not join, but those in Alberta and other parts of Canada could join. And in fact, there were 33 who joined. This was before Pearl Harbor, Shinjuwan no Mae. And so he joined in 1941, in the spring of 1941. Well, I think it was July of 1941. And Shinjuwan, as you know, was in December of 41. So he was in training in Eastern Canada with the Canadian Army at the time of Pearl Harbor. One of his fellow soldiers came to ask him if he was okay after hearing about Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war against Japan. And my dad says, well, I'm a Canadian, I'm here. Everybody thought there would be terrible things that would happen to the Japanese that were serving in the Canadian Army at that time. Nothing terrible happened. In fact, everybody tried to support them and help them and said that we were all together, we were comrades. And so, yes, he was able to serve, and he went to England, and then he landed in Normandy in 1944, in the 6th of June, and he fought in France, in Belgium, Holland, and in Germany. And in 1946, when he came back after the war, came back to Raymond, Alberta, the interesting thing was, when he left Raymond, there were maybe 500 Japanese Canadians in all of southern Alberta. That's how many there were. There weren't very many. When he came back from the war, there were 3,600. And because many of the Japanese were moved to southern Alberta and to the town of Raymond to work in the sugar beets as a result of the war. He was so surprised. But he was very pleasantly surprised because there he met my mother. She came from Langley, and lots of terrible things happened. And of course the injustice of the internment and the forced removal of the Japanese Canadians from the coast was a terrible thing. But some interesting things happened too, because if it hadn't been for that, my father would have never met my mother. She would have never gone to Alberta, but she was there. The ceremony here and the Remembrance Day is important for me because I can remember the sacrifices and the things that my great uncle, that my own father did at that time. And then, not because of anything I did, what it is my son joined the Canadian Armed Forces, and he ended up in Afghanistan twice. It caused his mother a lot of concern. But so for all of them, and for everybody else that served, I feel that it's important to remember them. And for the Japanese Canadian community, I think it's especially important because the things that they did set the stage for us to have all the rights and benefits that we do have now. So that's why I'm here, and that's why this Remembrance Day and all Remembrance Days are important for me. Thank you.
This Japanese Canadian Cenotaph is so important to the Japanese Canadian community. It was created 101 years ago in honor of the First World War Japanese Canadian veterans, but it's so much more than even just the people that were serving. The most important thing, of course, are the people, the soldiers that served, our Japanese Canadian soldiers, because too often in our history, we don't hear the stories about Japanese Canadians or any other racialized soldiers or Indigenous peoples who have served Canada so honorably. And part of the story for Japanese Canadians is that recognition that Japanese Canadians were here since the 1800s. They served their country. They are Canadians. Japanese Canadians tried to serve in World War II and were rejected. And some of them did get to serve, like my uncle. But this is the important story that when we say Remembrance Day, we say lest we forget, because we need to remember those stories. And part of it is having this important monument, the Cenotaph, because it's very visible of the stories that we can't forget and of our community. My uncle, Buck Suzuki, he was part of the fishing community in the Steveston area. And actually, my father's side of the family, They came in 1906 and they settled on an island called Oikawa Island in the Fraser River. They're part of the fishing community. So they've been established, as many Japanese Canadians were established for a long time. They are Canadians. World War II happened and they were the disrespect. They were not recognized as Canadians. And some of these Japanese Canadian men wanted to show their loyalty, to prove their loyalty, to show they're Canadians, to demonstrate that. So they volunteered. They wanted to fight. So my uncle, Buck Suzuki, tried to. He went to the Canadian Army and he was rejected. So my cousins told me that the British Army accepted him, and later on the Canadian Army said that he was on loan. So I believe it was part of the S-20 unit. And they served in Southeast Asia, and they helped Canada with the war effort. Remembrance Day means to me that we have to recognize that the stories of Canada are not complete. There are many stories we don't know of Indigenous peoples and racialized people. And one big part of Canadian history and British Columbia history are the stories of Japanese Canadians. And for Japanese Canadians, they served in World War I, they served in World War II, and they continue to serve. And so for Remembrance Day, it's important to remember the sacrifices that all those before us made so that we can enjoy our democracy. But it's truly important that we remember the story is not complete without those stories of Indigenous peoples and racialized people. And for me personally, because I'm fourth generation Japanese Canadian, it's important we never forget the contributions of Japanese Canadians.